They had the talent, the presence, the power to move crowds. But in old Hollywood, being black was hard enough. Being gay? That was a career death sentence. Still, these 10 legends broke ground, rewrote rules, and in quiet or courageous ways, lived their truth. Some were out, others were only outed by history. But all of them mattered. Today, we tell their stories, out loud. Let's uncover the black queer icons Hollywood tried to forget. Moms Mabley, long before the word representation became a buzzword, she was already doing it, in a wig, a house dress, and a smile that hid 1,000 wounds. Moms Mabley wasn't just the funniest woman on stage. She was the bravest. Born in 1894, a time when being black meant survival and being gay meant silence, Moms did both, with a mic in her hand and fire in her truth. She came out as a lesbian in the 1920s, decades before Stonewall, decades before coming out was even a phrase. And she did it not on the coasts or in queer-friendly cafes, but in dusty backrooms, all-black theaters, and segregated nightclubs across the American South. On stage, she played the toothless granny, sassy, silly, harmless. But offstage, she was sharp, political, and unapologetically queer. She made jokes about preferring young women over old men. She teased the idea of marriage and flirted with the line between comedy and confession. The audiences laughed, maybe not realizing she wasn't joking. And that was her genius. She could be fully herself, without ever saying too much, in a world that would have destroyed her for saying anything at all. Moms Mabley didn't hide in coded language. She wasn't forced into fake romances for publicity. She didn't need a beard. She didn't need a studio to approve her script. She wrote her own every night she stepped on stage. Her queerness wasn't a side note. It was core to her act, her defiance, her brilliance. She was a black, lesbian woman who made a living out of laughing the face of everything designed to erase her: racism, patriarchy, homophobia, trauma. And she made space for queer black voices in comedy, for women who dared to be funny and free, for truths too raw to say out loud, unless you wrap them in a punchline. So the next time someone says being out and proud is just trendy, tell them about Moms Mabley, who did it before it was safe, before it was celebrated, and long before the world was ready. If she were starting out today, do you think she'd be embraced or still misunderstood? Bayard Rustin. While some broke boundaries with laughter, others did it through revolution. Bayard Rustin organized the March on Washington. He stood beside Martin Luther King Jr. He taught nonviolence to a movement that shook the world. And yet, you probably didn't learn his name in school. Why? Because Bayard Rustin was gay. And in 1960s America, especially in black politics, being openly gay wasn't just frowned upon, it was political suicide. Bayard didn't try to hide. He didn't need to. By the time he was mentoring King, he had already been arrested for sexual perversion, already had his mugshot printed in papers, already been dragged through public shame. And still, he chose visibility. He chose truth, and he chose to keep marching. He was the mind behind the microphone, the architect behind the dream, the man who mobilized 250,000 people to stand peacefully in front of the Lincoln Memorial, a feat no one had accomplished before. But for the movement's more conservative leaders, Bayard was a threat. Not because of his politics, but because of who he loved. They feared the headlines, feared distraction, feared association with a known homosexual. So they erased him. They pushed him aside. His name was left off programs, his face cut from photographs. He was called a liability to the cause, even by those who stood on stages he built. And still he didn't walk away. Because Bayard believed something radical, that you cannot build true freedom for anyone while denying it to someone. He once said, "We need, in every community, a group of angelic troublemakers," and that's exactly what he was, an angelic troublemaker. Not in spite of his queerness, but because of it. Bayard Rustin gave his brilliance, his strategy, his peace, and in return, history gave him silence. Until now. Do we celebrate only the parts of people that make us comfortable, or are we finally ready to tell the whole story? James Baldwin. James Baldwin didn't come into the world quietly, and he sure as hell didn't leave quietly either. In a country where being black already meant being watched, and being gay meant being erased, he stood at the intersection and refused to vanish. He grew up in Harlem, raised by a stepfather who hated his softness, and a church that taught him his desire was sin. But even as a boy, Baldwin understood. If he wanted to survive, he'd need to make his truth louder than their shame, and so he did. In 1956, he released Giovanni's Room, a novel so openly, unapologetically homosexual that even his publisher panicked. Friends told him, "This will ruin you. No one wants a gay black writer." But Baldwin wasn't writing for everyone. He was writing for the ones who never saw themselves, not in books, not in movies, not in the mirror. And what he gave them was a mirror they didn't know they needed. His queerness wasn't just a theme, it was a declaration. I exist, and I feel, and I love. He refused to be tokenized, refused to be sanitized. He wasn't a neat fit for the civil rights movement, too flamboyant, too sexual. He wasn't embraced by the early gay rights movement either, too black, too political. He didn't belong anywhere. So he created a space of his own, in literature, in media, in memory. And he never softened the truth. He said what others couldn't or wouldn't. That racism and homophobia are not separate evils. They're twin weapons used by the same hand. And yet, through all the exile, the threats, the betrayals, he still loved, he still dreamed. And he still believed that art could save a life. Baldwin was never asking to be accepted. He was demanding to be seen, in full, without compromise. If you've ever been told you're too much of something, too loud, too soft, too gay, too complicated, James Baldwin was already there, writing you into history before you were even born. Richard Bruce Nugent. While most men hid their desires in silence or shame, Richard Bruce Nugent turned his into poetry, and not the kind of soft, veiled metaphors that let readers pretend they didn't see. No, he made queerness unmistakable, beautiful, erotic, black. In 1926, he wrote a short story called Smoke, Lilies, and Jade. It was dreamlike, raw, and explicitly about a black man in love with another man. He published it under his real name in a magazine distributed throughout Harlem, at a time when being openly gay could get you killed, arrested, or worse, erased. Nugent wasn't trying to be provocative. He just wasn't willing to lie. While other writers cloaked same-sex desire in code, he laid it bare. In language that danced between masculine and feminine, between freedom and fear, he painted, he performed, he dressed how he wanted, loved who he wanted. He lived in Harlem, in the middle of the Renaissance, a cultural revolution bursting with jazz, poetry, sex, and secrets. But while most queer men of his time lived in the shadows, Nugent was walking in daylight. Of course, he paid a price. Publishers ignored him. Critics called him difficult, strange, undisciplined. Even some of his closest black contemporaries, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, distanced themselves from his openness, because his queerness was too bold, too free, too dangerous for a world still invested in control. But Nugent didn't bend. He lived openly, wrote truthfully, and refused to shrink for the comfort of others. He called himself the only truly gay man in Harlem. Not because others didn't exist, but because he was the only one who dared to say so out loud. Richard Bruce Nugent didn't just push boundaries, he ignored them. And in doing so, he left a legacy that queer writers, black, brown, trans, femme, are still drawing power from today. When the world gave him silence, he gave it back a story. One that said, yes, I'm here, and yes, I want to be seen. Little Richard. Little Richard didn't just invent a sound, he invented a space where a black, flamboyant, gender-bending man could stand center stage and set the world on fire. Long before the world had language for it, he was already living it. Gay, outrageous, unapologetically sexual. In the 1950s, that wasn't just radical, it was dangerous. But Richard didn't flinch. He wore eyeliner, tight pants, and platform heels. He moaned into microphones and threw his hips like he meant it. He flirted with men from the stage and slept with them after the show. Proudly, loudly, publicly. He said it himself. I've been gay all my life. I knew it, My family knew it, God knew it, and yet as the fame grew, so did the fear. Not just from others, but from within. Raised in the Black Pentecostal church, Richard lived in constant tension. A gospel-trained boy who preached fire and brimstone by day and chased men in hotel rooms by night. He believed God had made him beautiful, but punished him for loving the way he did. So he ran back and forth across that line. One year, he was the queerest thing in music. The next, he was condemning homosexuality on Christian TV. He called himself a sinner. But history calls him something else, a pioneer who brought queerness into the mainstream before the world had a name for it. The truth is, Little Richard's queerness was never subtle. It was his swagger, his scream, his glitter. It was in every beat he played and every boundary he broke. Even when he tried to bury it under a Bible, you could still hear it, in the way he made straight America squirm and dance anyway. He didn't always love his queerness, but he gave it to the world. And for millions of queer kids watching from the shadows, that was enough. Can someone struggle with who they are and still change the world because of it? Little Richard did, loudly, brilliantly, irrevocably. Jimmie Daniels, he walked into the room like he belonged there, because he did. Not just because he could sing, but because he knew how to make people look, not stare. Look, Jimmie Daniels wasn't the kind of queer man history usually remembers. He didn't write fiery speeches or lead a march. He didn't have to. He stood in front of a piano in a black tuxedo and sang in a voice smooth enough to stop conversations and start glances. In 1930s Harlem, queerness was underground, hidden behind closed doors, fake marriages, and coded language. But Jimmie lived in the open, not shouting it, not hiding it, just being. He performed at Café Society, the first fully integrated nightclub in New York, where black and white, straight and queer, rich and working class, all gathered under low lights and high expectations. Daniels didn't perform like someone asking for approval. He performed like someone who already had it. He was a favorite of high society. Artists, writers, politicians, wealthy men who sat a little too close. And he wasn't just accepted, he was wanted. Carl Van Vechten, a white gay writer and patron of the Harlem Renaissance, fell deeply for Jimmie, not for what he represented, but for what he refused to hide. Their relationship, like many of Jimmie's, didn't fit into the polite categories of the time, but Jimmie never asked it to. Being black and gay in the 1930s was enough to destroy a man. But Daniels moved through that world with elegance, not despite who he was, but because he wore it like silk. He wasn't loud, he wasn't political, he wasn't a tragedy. He was a man who dared to live in full view, in a world that told him to shrink. Jimmie Daniels may not appear in most queer history books, but for those who saw him, he was unforgettable. And sometimes that's the quiet kind of revolution that lasts longest. Johnny Mathis, he never had a scandal, never had a tabloid heartbreak, never stormed off stage, and yet he sang about love better than anyone alive. Johnny Mathis was smooth, not just in voice, but in every move he made. Where others chased headlines, he floated above them. In the 1950s, he was America's golden boy, a black singer who crossed over into white households, not with rebellion, but with romance. He sang of longing, heartbreak, devotion, the kind that could melt any heart. But he never said who those songs were really about. Because behind the soft tuxedos and gentle smile, Johnny Mathis was gay. Not flamboyant, not political, not tragic, just quietly, confidently, undeniably gay. The industry knew, his friends knew, his fans, they guessed, but no one pushed. Because Mathis was too clean, too classy, too essential to disturb. He didn't play the PR games. He turned down fake romances and photo-op girlfriends. He declined offers to play the Hollywood leading man narrative. Not out of fear, but because he didn't feel he owed the world a performance off stage. Behind the curtain, he lived with male partners, attended parties, showed up to events with the same friend year after year. And the world simply let him be, until 1982. In a quiet quote buried in a magazine profile, Mathis acknowledged what many had long suspected. Homosexuality is a way of life that I've grown accustomed to. That sentence caused a ripple. Not outrage, not applause, just a moment of silence. Then the world returned to the music, as if nothing had been said. Because Johnny Mathis didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need a coming out moment. He was the moment. And maybe that's the most radical kind of pride. Not fighting to be seen, but refusing to be invisible in the first place. Johnny Mathis didn't break the rules. He made the world quietly bend around him. Ethel Waters, they called her Sweet Mama Stringbean, a voice that could hush a room, a woman who went from scrubbing floors to commanding the stage at Carnegie Hall. Ethel Waters was a force, a gospel-belting, no-nonsense, take-no-prisoners powerhouse. She broke barriers for black women in music, on Broadway, in Hollywood. But behind the gowns, behind the sermons, behind the Bible quotes were whispers. Because for all her fire, Ethel Waters had a soft spot for women. She never said it outright, never sat down for an interview and said, "Yes, I'm gay." But stories lingered, and so did the name. Ethel and Ethel. Her longest, most intense relationship was with her secretary, a woman also named Ethel. Friends said they were inseparable, lived together, traveled together, dressed alike. Coincidence? Maybe. But it didn't stop the rumors. When asked about love, Waters often dodged the question or turned it into a sermon. She once said, "I trust in Jesus, that's all the man I need," which is beautiful and also extremely lesbian-coded. But let's not pretend the times were easy. Waters came from deep pain, abused, abandoned, dragged through poverty. She didn't just carry trauma, she sang through it. And for a queer black woman of faith in the early 1900s, survival sometimes meant rewriting your own truth or hiding it in plain sight. She was moody, she was dramatic, she could tear you down with a look, but she could also raise you up with a single verse of "His eye is on the sparrow." Maybe she was queer, maybe she wasn't. Maybe she loved in ways the world didn't have words for yet. But here's what we do know. Ethel Waters walked into rooms that weren't built for women like her and left them changed forever. And if there was another Ethel waiting at home when she did, well, that's between them and God. Alain Locke. If Ethel Waters was gospel, Alain Locke was symphony. Harvard degree, Oxford doctorate, speech like silk, brain like fire. He didn't just join rooms, he rewrote the conversations inside them. As the first Black Rhodes Scholar, Locke spent his life turning the Harlem Renaissance into a movement, not just a moment. He mentored Langston Hughes, advised Zora Neale Hurston, edited anthologies that redefined Black identity. But while he pushed artists to speak their truths, he stayed silent about his own. Because Alain Locke was most likely gay. Like, open your letters and it's all there gay. He never married, never dated a woman, and his most passionate correspondences were with younger male students, full of poetic flattery, late-night philosophical yearnings, and just enough subtext to make queer historians say, "Oh, honey, this wasn't just mentorship." He lived with male companions, took long trips with them across Europe, and maintained relationships best described as emotionally intense and extremely roommate-adjacent. Did he ever say the word? No. But in his journals, he wrote about a profound sense of difference. And that difference didn't seem to come from his intellect. Still, he walked a razor's edge between respectability and resistance, between what he taught and what he couldn't admit. Because being a Black gay man in academia in the 1930s meant playing a perfect hand while hiding your cards. Every day, he never shouted his truth, but he wrote it between the lines, between the friendships, the mentorships, the long walks in European gardens, and sometimes between the Oxford commas. Was Alain Locke gay? Let's just say, if closets had mahogany bookshelves and Latin inscriptions, he was living in the deluxe edition. But joke aside, without Locke, Black queer art wouldn't have had a renaissance at all. And for a man who never spoke the word, his influence speaks volumes. Luther Vandross. And now, we end this list with a man whose voice could turn loneliness into poetry. Luther Vandross didn't just sing about love. He was love. From Here and Now to A House Is Not a Home, he gave the world candlelight ballads, wedding anthems, and soundtracks for slow dancing in empty kitchens. But while millions swayed to his music, Luther himself remained still, alone, and silent. He never came out, never gave us a partner, never posed with a soulmate for the cameras. Instead, he kept his private life behind velvet curtains, and when asked, he'd change the subject faster than a Grammy fade-out. But let's be honest, people knew, people always kind of knew, the bachelorhood, the tight-knit circle of male assistants, the unmatched interior decorating skills. Fans whispered, the press speculated. Even Patti LaBelle, bless her soul, slipped once and said he didn't want to upset his mother. He wanted to be loved by everybody. And that's the heartbreak, because Luther wasn't hiding from himself. He was hiding from us, from the church crowds, from the R&B radio stations, from a world that wanted him to sing about love, but not his love. He was the voice of intimacy, but no one was allowed to be intimate with him. Not publicly, not truthfully. And yet, he sang anyway. He gave the world romance while holding his own behind a locked door. He died in 2005, alone, no memoirs, no tell-all, just whispers and that unmistakable voice. So, was Luther Vandross gay? Well, if you still need that spelled out, you probably also think Liberius just liked sequins. Let's be real. Luther deserved to be loved loudly. He deserved to be kissed backstage, to be held in spotlights, not shadows. But he gave us everything else. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we give him back his truth. Because the man who taught the world how to love should have gotten to be loved too. These weren't just artists, they were pioneers who lived in a world that asked them to choose, black or queer, seen or safe. Some came out, some didn't, but all of them left a mark. Their voices changed culture, even when they couldn't speak their truth out loud. And now we've said their names, out loud, together. Which story hit you hardest? Which name surprised you? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because these stories matter. And silence was never the ending they deserved.